So I think what we'll ask is if all the panelists could turn on their camera for everyone to see. Everybody has met Tom Froelich and Mike Zinda. Tom is from Chinook. Mike is from Repair Therapeutic. And then we have the pleasure also to join on the panel, by Ocho from BMS, and also by Stacy Seltzer from Aisling. So maybe just as an introduction, maybe if I can ask Dr. Cho and Seltzer to introduce themselves, that would be nice before we start. So maybe, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hi. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. So as Stefan said, my name is Ho Cho, and I lead the Discovery Biotherapeutics organization for BMS. Scientifically, I initially trained as a chemist and then switched to NMR spectroscopy. So I'm a structural biologist and biophysicist, and that's the scientific lens that I use to look at various opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stacy?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Stacy Seltzer. I'm a partner at Aisling Capital. Aisling is a life science focused investment firm. We're based in New York, but we invest across North America as well as Europe. We tend to invest in clinical stage and maybe in some earlier preclinical biopharma and a little bit on the med device side, investing both in the private companies as well as public companies.
Thank you. Okay, so this panel is about building biotech ecosystem. The first question is for Stacy. So we've heard about representatives from Chinook and Repair that are two great examples of successful Canadian startups that have both gone public this year. As an investor, what do you see as some of the main difficulties for Canadian startups? And what is your perception of the biotech ecosystem in Canada? How have you seen that change in your years in the industry?
Sure. Well, Aisling has invested in Canadian companies in the past. I think maybe going back when I joined Aisling about 12 years ago, the Canadian ecosystem was a bit earlier in its evolution, and the talent pools were just forming for folks who would be able to not only provide the scientific expertise, but also the business side of building a biotech company. And I'd say over the past 5 to 10 years, we've definitely seen that that pool of talent grow. And as we look at opportunities, we consider an investment in Canada the same as we'd consider an investment in most parts of America. I think the one question you have to answer is you have to build a critical mass of syndicate. And so I think really not just getting one investor in the U.S. You need to get a few investors in the U.S. and we kind of like to invest in groups, not just individually. So I think that's one piece that you have to get comfortable with. And obviously there are a number of great investors in Canada as well that we've worked with in the past. I think as a company, what you have to consider is finding a way to get warm introductions, so people will take a look at your business plan. And in this day and age where everything is pretty much virtual, it's easy to have an introductory conversation and get things going. That's how we look at it.
Thank you. So the next question is for Mike and Tom. Maybe take turns in answering the questions. So although we heard the background stories of your companies, what would you say was the one key ingredient to the successful journey to build a startup and maybe to raising money at key stages? So maybe we can start with Tom.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. And I'm actually going to slightly non-answer the question because I'm going to say there's not just one element, I don't think. I usually think about it in three ways, three key elements. And I think about this like in my role in fundraising for Chinook, but also, as you mentioned, Stefan, I've got that EIR function at Versant. So look at opportunities from that perspective as well.
Yep.
And so the three things that I've kind of stolen this from other colleagues of mine, but are team, theme, and assets. And for a good startup in biotech, I think you need some element of all three of those things. They obviously don't have to all be exactly the same in terms of strength, but you do need a team that is experienced and can really deliver on what you're promising to do. I think we all know drug discovery is extraordinarily hard, and having people that are experienced in doing that is essential. With Chinook, we were extremely fortunate to get the team that came out of the Inception Sciences group in Vancouver. So that was a very talented group of small molecule drug hunters, had spent years working together at Merck in Montreal before that. So really, when an investor looked at that team, knew that they could execute on a plan. The second part is theme. So you have to be going after an area of high unmet need. I like that question actually from Mike's presentation about, you know, when can you be best in class versus first in class? And I think that investors are really looking for you to break open a new opportunity. So like Mike's doing with synthetic lethality, it's a massive opportunity in oncology. You know, we think that bringing precision medicine to kidney disease is unlocking a huge potential. So you need that thematic of you're going after something big. And then the third aspect is around assets. You need to have one or two things beyond team and theme that you can actually show you're going to get to a meaningful inflection point where you're actually going to deliver some value at some point in the future on a prescribed timeline where, you know, the money you're asking for is going to get you to a spot where you're de-risking something or proving out a thesis. So you need at least one or two assets that you can showcase with some data that you're going to do that. So we happened to at Chinook, we had an internal program that's now 336 that's going towards IND. We had some good data around that for our early Series A. But then as we continued fundraising, we had in-licensed atrasentan. You know, that obviously was a phase 3 asset, which suddenly became much more interesting to investors.
Nice. And Mike, what is it for you for Repair that you think was particularly important to develop the biotech, the startup?
It's Tom taking all my answers. I think I'd just say I agree fully with the base of what he highlighted. And what I would add to it is I think was really having a portfolio of opportunities and executing on them, right? So it's building that trust from the investor world that what you say you're going to do and your transparency around that delivery is clear, and that you basically execute on that. I think that can get lost at times with ideas versus execution. And it's really the two that have to come together and deliver a drug that actually helps a patient.
All right, and then can you know, we talk about what the most important aspect, but how about the difficulties and the challenge? And this question is maybe appropriate for Mike, since you had a lot of experience in the startup or pharma world in the US and in Boston. So can you contrast both ecosystem and maybe talk about the difficulties of doing this type of business here in Canada compared to Boston?
Yeah, so I'll touch on, I guess, a couple of key things from my perspective. And one, again, I'm biased from a very Boston perspective, where there's tons of biotech startups and where almost every postdoc and graduate student knows somebody that's in the industry. And so it's a very unique situation, right? So recruiting is extremely different. You can pick people out, they know what they're getting into and they understand what they're doing. What I found in the Canadian environment, and to be frank, in areas outside of large biotech centers, is that people are very unfamiliar with what you actually do for a living in biotech or pharma. And they often get very bad advice, in my opinion, again, very biased, from their current employer, et cetera, that makes them even more scared about what they're doing and going into, that it's secondary science, a lesser world, what have you. So I think that was one of the big ones. We saw that quite often. I think over time now, there's more of a network. We have more and more people, so we're seeing that a little bit less by the people that are coming in, but that was one of the big components. Then I think the other was just specific skill sets, right? So in Montreal, as a specific example, there was a ton of pharma in that space, and we were able to take a great advantage of that, and that because of different economic reasons, most of those pharma left, and so there was some incredibly great people that we were able to bring on board. But there were certain types of skill sets that just weren't very evident within that microenvironment that were very specific. And so that meant that we had to create a kind of a two-part, a US and a Montreal base where we were able to fill in some of those key things in bioinformatics, for instance, and oncology being a specific example of people who had done that in detail. Was very hard to find those folks up in Montreal, and so we ended up building that here in some of the more clinical side of things, in oncology in specific, because it was probably the one therapeutic area that wasn't present at the pharma companies when they were in Montreal.
Thank you. And Tom, on the other end, can you maybe speak to some advantages or that you were able to leverage from the Canadian ecosystem that was key to start Chinook?
Yeah, I think that the Canadian ecosystem, I think it's a lot of Canadian characteristics where people are extremely collaborative, extremely helpful. You know, when we said in Vancouver we wanted to start a new company, didn't really know what it was going to be about or what we were going to be targeting. You know, everybody was really helpful to pitch in, and you know, everyone's door is open to be able to knock and say, hey, we're thinking about this. You know, what are your perspectives? And being able to access really top science really early, because there is incredible science across Canada, and partnering that with that openness and that willingness to collaborate really helped us really early on kind of formulate our thesis around what we wanted to do. So that was extremely helpful. The other thing is, I think increasingly there is access to capital here too, which didn't historically occur. I think you know, the three elements you think about that you need to raise to start a company, which we talked about a little bit, but you think about good science and money, like that's actually plentiful now in Canada with the great science through the academic institutions, and then more and more venture capital firms, you know, willing to do business here, like Stacy was outlining. So I think that's really helpful. But I totally agree with Mike. I think the one challenge we have in Canada, but I don't think it's just a Canada problem. I think it's an outside Boston, outside San Francisco problem, is access to those people who have experience. And I think that's the rate limiting step for the ecosystem here in Canada, is getting people who have done it before, who, as Mike really nicely pointed out, can build that trust with investors that, you know, their money is going to be in safe hands and is going to be spent well.
Oh, I see you were noting. Do you want to comment on these topics a bit?
Well, I think first of all, I agree that the science in Canada is actually quite remarkable in terms of the innovations that emerge. So you guys are aware that BMS announced our intention to acquire Forbius. You know, that was work done by Maureen up in Montreal. And that was amazing. Decades of TGF-beta biology and protein engineering that I just think is fabulous. I think you also know that we have a deep relationship with Zymeworks. And so, you know, they are leaders in certain aspects of protein engineering. And we have a deep relationship with Dev Sidhu through the recombinant antibody network at the University of Toronto. So I think there's clear early science that's quite innovative, but I also think it can be challenging in terms of having the seasoned veteran. I think, you know, having the seasoned drug hunter involved and getting people to, you know, contemplate, you know, moving to Canada or working remotely, however it's got to be done. I think with this COVID, it might teach us that you could actually have people located all over the world that contribute to bringing things forward. And so I think that will potentially further accelerate some of the biotechs getting formed in geographies that we would normally not think in terms of, like Boston, San Francisco, San Diego. So I think, you know, there's going to be lots of good things to happen.
So let's start a bit on the second topic of this panel discussion, which is on industry academia collaboration, right? And we heard about Chinook and Repair that are a really good example where the foundation was really coming from academia. And you both at Celgene and BMS, as you mentioned, you've been quite supportive of academia industry collaboration and translating academic discoveries to potential industry asset. So, for example, Celgene has made several large investments in basic research in Canada, as you mentioned, and is also specifically in Toronto and at the University of Toronto. So what are some of the main criteria that big pharma companies are looking from academics when establishing these collaborations?
Well, from my perspective, I think it's an understanding and realization that no matter how large your internal scientific workforces, you can't cover the waterfront of all the emerging novel science. And so I think from my perspective, you know, championing these types of early collaborations is really with an eye towards identifying novel targets, novel biology, and novel concepts, and just having enough of a scientific relationship where we can provide input to the experimental design of how to carry things forward. And, you know, and also I think the other thing that's very helpful is to have partners that are very focused on transparent communication of the data. I think a lot of times, I think that's where sometimes people, and that's why a lot of times you end up doing deals with people you already know and have relationships with, because you feel like they're going to see the totality of the data, which will give you a better understanding of not only the opportunity, but also the risks inherent in various early stage efforts.
Mm-hmm. And how about the roadblocks and limitations? You know, when you're trying to set up this industry academic collaborations, what have you faced in terms of limitation, not only in Canada, but everywhere?
Oh, yeah.
What is it? What is it that is so hard for farmers?
Is this is being recorded? Is this being recorded? I don't want this.
It is, but it's okay.
Okay, I guess the way I think about it, it is at some point you need to formalize a relationship through, you know, putting things into words and into contracts, and that creates a whole host of issues. You know, I think if you have the ability to push forward on ideas based on just personal trust, you can actually get a lot of stuff done. When you have to start pulling in various folks from the various legal departments and BD departments, you have a lot more. Well, let me put it simply, right? So it's like, you know, if you're going to get a divorce, you probably ought to have a lawyer. But if you're going to get married, it's probably not necessarily the most facile way to proceed. And so I think that's challenging. And I think a lot of the academic institutions, especially in California, have to answer to governing bodies that have set criteria on what language is and is not acceptable. I mean, I remember going through trying to get the initial recombinant antibody network collaboration in place. And it took days of getting the lawyers in the room and getting people to, you know, compromise on some of these topics that could be quite challenging. I think if you wanted to accelerate new company formation coming straight out of academia or institutes, having a pre-negotiated set of terms, especially on the simpler things around, you know, indemnification or certain types of, you know, like disaster check kinds of language, that would be very, very helpful, because you spend an inordinate amount of time dealing with that as opposed to like thinking through whether the science is going to really have merit, quite honestly.
Tom, Mike, and Stacy, I'm sure you have faced some of the same hurdles. Can you comment from your experience? Stacy, maybe? Yeah.
I think from my perspective, tech transfer offices at different, you can't really paint it with the same brush across all different academic institutions, because some tech transfer offices are very good at making things happen and moving at a reasonable pace, and other tech transfer offices are sleepy and it takes years to get anything done. And as a venture capitalist or as a big pharma company, you want to partner with those institutions where they're really interested and engaged in getting and out licensing and getting their technology out, and, you know, have took the time to build the tech transfer office.
Yeah. So what's the differentiator? So you've known both sides, right? So some that work well, some that doesn't work well. So is it speed to going through the files, or is it just the level of scrutiny that is going on, or the level of bureaucracy that is going on in some tech transfer versus others? Can you clarify a bit what you mean?
I don't think it's speed. I think it's actually the individual you're working with, and they're willing. You know, there are some things that are boilerplate and that you can set up in advance, but every collaboration at some level is unique. You're dealing with an investigator that has unique requirements. You're dealing with so many different elements that having, you know, somebody in the tech transfer office that cares and is going back and forth and really is being a good intermediary is what I find to be the most valuable. And there are certain tech transfer offices that do that quite well.
If I could also add to that, because I
Yeah.
totally agree with Stacy, it's really the individual, but I've also found the PI also has a huge role to play there, because I've dealt with PIs who just sort of say, oh yeah, the tech transfer office will deal with it, and then they kind of check it over to the tech transfer person who doesn't really understand what the objective of the relationship is, and then you would just run into all sorts of problems. So if that investigator can really closely work with that tech transfer office, tell them why it's important, what you're trying to accomplish, and what are reasonable risks to think about, unreasonable risks, and then help shepherd it through the process, that makes all the difference in my experience.
Yeah,
And
I
Mike,
agree with that completely. I think, having, like, I think with regard to the RAN, we were dealing, UCSF was acting as the lead, and having Jim Wells involved was critical, and having him be in the room with me to help corral the conversation around what to worry about, what not to worry about. I think if we hadn't done that, it would have never gotten done, quite honestly.
So what I'm hearing is having a champion both on the biotech pharma side, having a champion on the academic side, the PI, that can maybe nag the tech transfer office, but also an efficient tech transfer office, which is maybe also the quality of the individuals there, right? So because we've been hearing the same problems, right, over and over, and it's not clear if it's just a problem of bandwidth, but it seems that it's more than that, right? It's really I guess the attention to details and the quality of the individuals in place that makes a difference. So maybe Stacy, I wanted to ask you a question on the second topic. As an investor, and you've seen a lot of startup emerging from many different academic institutions, beyond the relationship with tech transfer office, can you think of the key elements that enable companies to launch from academic centers?
Sure, I think that initial dose of capital can come from a few different places, and these companies that are able to spin out of tech transfer offices, they do have founders, but then they have somebody who really wants that company to get going and is super scrappy and looking all over the place for the capital, because the capital can come from angels, sometimes it can come from VCs, sometimes it can come from partnership, sometimes it can come from a competition. And in those early stages when you're just getting it out of a tech transfer office, finding ways to access those smaller pools of capital and then doing something with it that's actually meaningful. That's the difference between a startup that gains traction, start making progress, versus another one that's a great idea but kind of languishes along and doesn't actually make progress. So having that, I think, just to put a finer point on it, having that person who's passionate and who's working, either is the founder, but more often than not, the founder is an inventor, is a PI who's still associated with the academic institution. So having that, other business person or scientific person who wants to take this on full time and turn over every rock, that's really how these startups get started, unless they're lucky enough to have a VC that plays that role for them.
Anybody else wants to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think, there's that part of science that we call the valley of death, where the science is already evolved to the point that you can't get good academic funding, but it's not enough to get really serious VC money. And how do you generate the enough resources to run some critical experiments that will then, really define what the real opportunity looks like? And I think the more ways we could have of funding that, and I think at Celgene, we used to support these like golden ticket kinds of competitions, as well as, I think with Inception, we invested just to provide funds to do those. And these are like, a few $100,000 can make or break something, right? If you have a couple $100,000 to run some in vivo proof of concept that could really make just an idea, something much more tangible that then can warrant further investments. I think we need to figure out how to have more and more of those types of opportunities created for the entrepreneurial academics to really be able to access those types of funds. I think is going to be critical for further driving and accelerating innovation coming out of academic and institutes. Very nice. Mike, I see you unmuted yourself. You want to comment?
I would just reiterate, I think what both Ho and Stacy said was, it's transferring that academic thought process into an actionable therapeutic process. And I think that that hurdle is sometimes larger than people think. So what you need for a paper, what you need to convince your academic colleagues may be different than what you need to convince someone that this has therapeutic potential and the legs to move forward. And so how is it that you're getting that other perspective that's necessary to make sure you can create the data to build a story that's credible and that's investable? And I think that that requires some humility at times for some people, but also just some additional help, right? And insights from others looking at that. And I think that finding that other person or that other, group of people that can help you do that can be a huge impact on how many of those move forward to an actual project and startup company.
All right, so thank you very much. We'll move to our next topic, which inevitably, because of the timing of this symposium, we had to talk about COVID-19 and its impact on everything we talk about, right? And O mentioned that maybe it's going to teach us that we can do things remotely, and maybe there's some advantages to that, to be able to get people in the same virtual room, right? Almost at will. But and it's a question for everyone. So what do you envision are going to be the short and long-term effects of the COVID-19 epidemic on the pharma and biotech industries? So maybe it's I'm sure you've already feeling the impact, but maybe if you're forward looking, what are going to be, the limitation that this is going to cause, and maybe also the opportunities? Mike, you want to go ahead?
I guess there's a practical one that I think it's changed for ourselves and for several I know is obviously we're highly dependent on different CROs, et cetera, around the world. And I guess we've really diversified where their location is. Okay, so you're not located in just one spot and have all of your eggs in one basket. And not being centralized just within the company, but actually leveraging those CROs much more than you would in a large company. It actually can give you a huge advantage on maintaining momentum during large pandemics that are occurring. Because we have things in India, we have things in China, we have things in Canada, et cetera. And each of those had issues, but they were temporally distinct from one another. And their reaction to that was very different. So it allowed us to maintain business continuity throughout that whole process and really drive things forward. So I think that's one of the long-term changes that would just be a practical component of what we're doing. Then also the pluses and minuses of Zoom, right? So I think in one way it's great. We can do a lot of meetings and we could actually be much more efficient at certain processes. But I also think though there's an intrinsic innovation that comes from engaging one another face-to-face with one-off conversations that just don't occur in a formal Zoom setting. No matter how informal you like to make it, it's still a meeting that was set up for a reason. And I think that's one of the things that will never go away from a face-to-face interaction, or we have to find more innovative ways to actually deliver on that through a virtual perspective.
Yeah,
Tom, do you want to
yeah,
comment?
I can just build exactly. My thinking was along the lines of what Mike was saying around the clinical trials. I think one positive that's going to come out of this is the way we think about recruiting and monitoring patients in trials. I know that as we're designing our phase 3, what we started with our protocol 12 months ago is quite different now, largely because patients don't want to go into a doctor several times a month for monitoring. And I think that's pushed us really to think about remote monitoring in a much different way, and how do we collect data in a fashion that doesn't require face-to-face interaction. And that's, I think, going to help us streamline it in a lot of ways and make it easier for patients and clinicians to take part in trials. So I think you have to be an optimist to be in biotech. So that's kind of one positive that's coming out of this. I think we're getting much more efficient at running trials. So I think that's been a positive impact of COVID. On the negative side, yeah, it's really tough to think about supply chains if you have one issue in China around where CDMO is, and suddenly you can't get starting material. It's pretty challenging, and so you do have to think about diversifying. But the other part is we've had to hire about 30 people without ever actually meeting them, which is quite challenging as well through Zoom. And I think we're at the point now where things are working pretty well, but you can feel like, as new teams form and keep working together, that things are starting to bend a little bit. And normally, you would handle that with, let's have an offsite for a couple of days and kind of hash things out. And I think we're struggling with how do we deal with that in this environment.
And Stacy, maybe can you comment on the perspective of access to capital or fundraising, VC? Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, it's not completely surprising to me, but investment firms and venture capitalists, they've had no trouble going virtual. We do a lot of our work in the past by phone anyways. And actually Zoom has allowed us to do a lot more meetings face to face than maybe we would have been able to do in the past. And, you know, as an investment firm, we've made multiple investments in this pandemic and felt completely comfortable. Although I will say in most cases, we'd met some or all of the management team in person, either in prior jobs or in their current role, but, you know, in a previous attempt at financing. So, you know, eventually that's going to run out, and eventually we're going to have to start seeing people face to face, because, you know, in an industry like ours, having an interpersonal relationship beyond just a screen does matter to some extent. So you have to eventually get back there, but there's a lot we can do with our existing networks and people we trust. What surprises me, I got to say, and I'm interested what Ho has to say about this, is the number of multi-billion-dollar acquisitions that have occurred in this pandemic. And I was on the board of Aimmune, which was bought by Nestle. The deal officially closed today. And it's just fascinating to me that the big pharma companies who normally come in with like 30 people diligence teams to do diligence are feeling comfortable and capable of doing that fully remotely, to the point where they're willing to spend billions of dollars on these companies. I'm just curious, you know, from Ho's perspective, how that's been working.
Well, I would say, to your point earlier, a lot of these things that get announced are things that have been in motion for years. And so relationships have already been built in terms of certain key kinds of decision makers. And then, you know, most of the diligence is actually done through looking at data rooms nowadays. And then you have formal question and answers that go back and forth. And so I think, you know, the on-site visit, if you know people, it's not that critical, obviously, right? But in terms of my thoughts on COVID, I mean, you know, I don't know if this is pro or con, but it definitely forced me to learn a lot about virology. I don't know about you guys, but, you know, I read hell about coronaviruses and SARS-CoV-2. And then I've been watching what's going on in terms of the vaccine and therapeutic antibody development. And it's got me to realize we have to do a better job of explaining science to the broader population, because right now it's getting kind of, you know, done in a way that's not very helpful. And then I would say lastly, you know, as these vaccines and the therapeutic antibodies and other regimens emerge, how do we make sure that this is going to then get to the different parts of the world outside of North America and Europe, right? How do we, because, you know, if you want to get to some semblance of normalcy, you'd hope that these vaccines and treatments are available worldwide, so that you don't feel bad about going somewhere and potentially bringing something along with you or impacting those ecosystems in a negative way. And so that's got me thinking about like the emergence of these, especially in the realm that I work in, which is in the biotherapeutic space. How do we start to make those types of molecules more widely available? And so I think that bears a lot of consideration at this point, because I quite honestly, you know, with SARS-CoV-2, in many ways we got lucky in that it isn't as fatal as it could have been. Imagine the ability to spread of SARS-CoV-2 with the kind of lethality of the MERS, or even worse, right? And so how do we as a society prepare for that in the future is something I've been thinking a lot about. Quite
tremendous insight. So we have about 15-20 minutes left, and there's a lot of people in the audience. So I think what we'll do next is try to field some questions. So anybody that wants to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature, and then we're going to try to get through them as efficiently as possible. So the first one is, what are the most important skills to cultivate during your PhD for successful career in pharma and biotech? Anybody wants to answer that one?
Yeah.
What are you guys looking for hiring people? Yeah.
Well, to be successful in drug discovery and development, as we all know, requires huge teams. And so I would say, which is completely opposite of your PhD training, is to learn to collaborate and derive value and satisfaction from that collaboration. I think too often, as part of the PhD training, we are forced to be sole contributors, because that's how you get judged, to be the first author on papers or the primary person for an idea. I think to be successful, even in the biotech and even more so in larger companies, that you gotta want to collaborate. And if you don't want to collaborate, this is a tough business to be in.
Mike, go ahead.
I would just, I reiterate, this is definitely a team sport. For success, you have to work as a team. I think it's really critical, and I think actually the most successful companies end up being more team oriented than the other way around. But I think, as you're thinking, if you're a student and you're coming in and what do you need to learn, I guess for me, I think the really key component is, no matter where you're going into, is understanding what's impactful versus what's interesting. So, right, there's tons of interesting roads to follow in science, and only a few of them lead to a paper or to a therapeutic impact. And it's figuring out what is important, right? What's that thing that's going to make an impact? And, you'll miss some opportunities along the way, but you can follow 50 threads. But the better you are at picking the 2 or 3, I think that the more successful you're going to be as you continue on through your academic or industry approach. I don't think they're actually different in that regard. And then it's about where your passion is, and what it is you want to do for the rest of your life, without actually knowing what all of it looks like. So it's kind of more about your passion for how close you want to be to patients, to the clinic. How much you want to be in driving totally, novel innovation in a different way from an academic side. But I think, they're a lot closer than they appear. And success, I think, in both is very similar.
And I do want to add on that front, the other thing to keep in mind is that, as you enter industry, learning doesn't stop. I think Mike makes a great point, is that you have to realize that it's the continuous learning, that you're going to have a certain role. And yes, you're going to deliver on that role, but beyond that, you need to learn more and more about the business in general, so that you can understand what is the best fit for you in terms of what you're interested in, how you can contribute to the organizations that you're part of.
Very good. So let's maybe talk about a little bit more about the practical skills, right? So in the last, I guess, 10 years or so, there was a lot of emphasis on genomics in companies, right, as a discovery tool. And Mike has certainly talked about the use of CRISPR now, and Tom mentioned the use of single-cell RNA sequencing. But can you think of other enabling technologies that are transforming the landscape of the pharmaceutical and biotech industry? And maybe those are skills that people should seek, if they're interested to pursue a career in companies.
I think you named several of them, but I would also assume CRISPR and other technologies that are allowing you to do mammalian genetics at scale. I think building model systems, as Tom had highlighted, being able to grow an nephron, to be able to ask a complex question in a less complex situation, to be able to build up that effort to get in ultimately to an in vivo or an intact animal model. So I think, innovations in modeling disease in unique and different ways. Oncology is maybe uniquely easy, but still has a long way to go compared to a neuroscience, which is much more challenging. But I think, how are you modeling the disease? How are you actually getting into the spaces that allow you to ask questions that couldn't be asked before? And then how are you also narrowing it down to the patient's genetics and how they impact that? So I think, genetics underlie many things. Environment obviously is a key component there. But how can you bring those pieces together? And what are the skill sets that allow you to do that?
Very nice. All right, and maybe a question for Stacy here. Can you comment on the trends that you're seeing in new startups, the approach that people are taking in the business plans that they have? It's a bit of a general question, but maybe you can comment on what you've seen. Yeah.
So what's interesting is things have come a bit full circle for me. I think platforms are becoming much more exciting and interesting, and that was the way it was 12 years ago when I started, and now and they went out of style. Now they're back. Obviously, when you get into clinical stage, you have to show that the platform actually leads to a clinical candidate. but a number of companies, preclinical companies, have gone public just on the strength of their platforms and or raised, you know, $50 to $100 million Series A, Series Bs. So if you have an interesting and differentiated platform where you can show how it can transform something, either an indication or a way of developing drugs, I think the platform has a lot of value in this day and age, and is well received by earlier stage investors. That's one big change.
Yeah. Okay, and then maybe move to another questions that we received. So it's a little bit more common in the US to see graduate students, PhD students start company. We're starting to see a bit of this desire, if you will, in Canada, but could you provide some advice for PhD students, graduate students interested in starting their own biotech company? Anybody wants to answer this? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would say it'd be very helpful if they could connect with someone that could give them advice about the pros and cons of what they're trying to do from a business perspective as well as a science perspective. I think the reason why more of these companies are happening in the US is that it's probably because a lot of the academic PIs now have been involved in company formation, so they can give that kind of advice. So I think having the right kinds of network or being able to have mentors involved in that process, I think can be very helpful.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree with that, Ho. I'd also add, it's probably easier to start a biotech if you're looking like medical devices or diagnostics, where the capital and the time scale is not as long as drug discovery. I think for a grad student to come out and kind of lead their own drug discovery biotech is probably pretty challenging, I would guess. It feels like these days, the ones that are successful, like the Repairs and Chinooks and others, are the ones that kind of have that experienced team that are able to raise that $50 to $100 million Series A to give them enough capital, not only to get far enough into the clinic or whatever, like inflection point, but also have enough money to then to attract other people that have done it before, to pay them that salary that they're used to. So I think it's pretty challenging in drug discovery to start something as a grad student. But that said, if you do have the idea or the ambition or the platform, then Ho's advice is perfect, where surround yourself by people that have done it before so you can attract that capital.
Yeah, I mean, like Zymeworks, I think, you know, Ali started that right out of his postdoc. And then if you look in Los Angeles, Zencor, Basil DeHyatt started that right out of graduate school. So it can be done, but it's much harder, and it can take 20 years before you actually get somewhere, right? So you know, it's a matter of, you have like a veteran team starting something, and you can attract enough capital, you can drive the idea much more quickly versus trying to do it organically. It's gonna, you know, it's gonna add years to the endeavor. But I encourage it. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I've learned being in this business for almost 2 decades is that you want fresh minds that are not going to listen to dogma as to what's a great idea, right? And that are willing to make the bet to try to come up with something very new. So.
Very good. All right, so we're nearing the end of the time we have. On behalf of all the attendees and on behalf of the organizer of this symposium, I would like to thank all of you for accepting to participate, to provide your insights, and for giving the talks, for Mike and Tom. That was very nicely done, so I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you again in future years at future symposiums of PRiME. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.